In this presentation, we will take a look at our first tax preparation problem, problem 1.1. You'll recall that there are three ways that we want to consider the tax preparation, three different angles we want to think about it within. One is to actually fill out the forms, the actual forms such as the 1040 and related schedules. The second is to be entering that information into an Excel worksheet so that we can consider it as a formula, more as a formula, kind of like a paper and pencil type of structure rather than entering it into the forms. And the third is to use tax preparation software to get used to a data input screen and the forms that would be used to input that screen, the interaction between the formulas, the forms, and the data input screens. Now, we're going to be in these practice problems using software to enter into the system and then verifying with the forms here, as well as doing a verification in a follow-up presentation to each one, which will then work through the same thing with formulas. So if you have access to some type of software, you can take that approach. If not, we will also be providing the actual forms for you, and you can find them on the IRS website at irs.gov in a PDF format and simply fill out the forms in that format as well. So if you don't have access to the software, you could use the free IRS software to basically do a projection type of thing, which is similar to basically a tax preparation software. And you can download the forms and simply enter the information into the forms and do the verification with the Excel worksheet that we will be providing for you. You should have a downloadable file which will have this information within it. We'll have the working file. This will be the information for our tax preparation. So typically you open this file, it'll have all the related forms for it, W-2 types form, 1099 type forms. We're going to do this from a perspective as if we're doing tax preparation for somebody else, because that's a little bit more difficult, and then you can apply it to yourself as well if you're doing your own taxes as well. Why is it more difficult to do somebody else's? Because you don't know their personal information. So the question is, what do I need to ask them for? Obviously, we need the tax documents. What other follow-up questions will be asked? And what order should I be asking those in? When should I ask these questions to get the information that is necessary? Then we have the answer files, and then we'll have the working files. These working files then are going to be the information that you can use to fill out. We're going to be including an open items worksheet, because I would always have an open items worksheet, which is basically your question sheet that if you were to ask a client or if you're going to ask a supervisor or something like that, these are questions that you have about the return. You always want to be jotting down the questions as they come to you as you start entering the return, and that'll be easier and easier as you do that. Then we have the tax preparation worksheet, which is going to be our formula worksheet here that you can use to double check the format. And then we're going to include some forms that are in PDF format that you can use to actually enter this information into the tax forms in a PDF type format. Therefore, like in practice, you can imagine yourself, if you're working in a tax office, it could be the case where if you have a partner, if it's a CPA firm or a tax firm, the partner obviously will be talking, most of the time will be talking to the client, and the data input individuals, people that are putting the data into the system, may not actually have a lot of interaction, or at least not the initial interview talking to the client. So if that is the case, then you're going to get most of your information just from the documents. And if you are discussing with clients, if you're going to clients and asking for documentation, even then, you're probably going to get some minimal information up front, including, you always want to get the date of birth, occupation, and that kind of information. And you can set up an organizer to do that, but oftentimes then you're gonna get the tax forms and start to fill out the tax return, and then you might have other questions that come up as you start to enter the data into the tax return. So you want to start visualizing in your mind, what kind of information can I get just simply from the forms, and what kind of information am I going to need to get further ask for as I ask for it. You want to ask for all that information up front in the initial interview if you have the chance to do that up front. If not, or if you don't ask up front, then you want to put all your information together in an open items list and be able to give it to the client at one time, so you don't have to keep calling back and forth on it with one email or one contact, and see how best to save everybody's time as you're asking for the follow-up documentation. So this is going to be the data form that we're going to be using for this first example. We're basically just going to have a W-2 client. We're going to keep it simple on the first example. This will be the data input form. This is obviously basically an Excel worksheet that's mocking the W-2 form. The actual W-2 form is on the right, so you can get an example of what the W-2 form will look like. So here's the W-2 form down below, so you can get the look and feel of it. And then if you have questions about any of the boxes within it, we have the instructions. So these are the instructions for the W-2 for 2019 from the IRS website at irs.gov. So we're going to give a kind of a mock W-2 so you can get a feel for the different boxes that are here. The main boxes are going to be 1 through 6 that we will be dealing with as we start out. And then, of course, we have the information type information up top as well. So when you first start talking to a client, if you have a brand new client, then you're thinking, well, what can I get from the W-2? Well, typically, you're going to have the name on the W-2. You're typically going to have the address on the W-2. So you could basically say, and you want to verify that. You want to say, hey, is the address on the W-2, is that correct? Is that the correct address that you want on the tax return? But that information will typically be there. You'll typically have the Social Security number as well on the W-2. So that's mainly what you need to set things up. And that's going to be similar for a 1099 form as well. You'll typically have possibly the Social Security number generally, and then the address. And those are going to be the main things you'll need. So what else might you want to ask in your open items list? As you go in the initial interview, you're always going to want to ask date of birth. Date of birth is important because if you get over a certain age, then things will change. So typically it won't have a big effect unless you're talking about someone that's younger that might be able to be claimed as a dependent possibly, or someone that is older and might be claimed as and have retirement type of information that could benefit or the standard deduction. So you always want it. You always want to have that in there. Put it into your software. Make sure your software will put it up there. You want it on the actual return. And then the occupation is something as data input information that you'll typically want as well. You may be able to know what that is with the W-2, but just be like, I want to put the correct occupation, whatever you feel would like your occupation to be, let me know, and that will be reported on the W-2. So those are two things that you're always going to need. You want to just basically ask those on the individual question. Now, you might have a lot of list of questions. There's a lot of possible things that you might need for somebody depending on what they do. And you could have organizers from the software that'll actually print out organizers. And I recommend giving those year over year because they actually remind people to get ready and remind people that you're here and give me this stuff. Some people really like them. Other people, it's too much information. They see the organizer and it has all the information to fill out within it if they so choose to. And oftentimes they just don't, right? And so it's too overwhelming for them. So in that situation, you got to think about, well, how much stuff do you want to ask in the initial interview? You don't want to overwhelm people. If you're mailing someone a list of information to give you, then that could be a bit overwhelming as well. The bare minimum you need, of course, to start is going to be this information. Give me the date of birth, give me the occupation. If you have a W-2, a lot of the other information will be on there. That will hopefully lead into more questions. Once you have that information, you could probably come back to them with follow-up questions and have more questions at that time. So you always want to have the open items list and list things out as you go. If we were to enter this into the software, then let's go into our Lacert software. We will be using Lacert here, data input, similar fashion for other software as well. It might be an interview process as opposed to the straight data input here, but you'll have a similar feed where you'll enter the data, of course, and then go to the forms. So we're going to go to the data, to the detail, and then within the detail, we're going to go to the client information. To start a new form, it's going to be a new form. Now, you might have another state. I'm going to say California as the other state, but I'm not going to focus on another state. State returns will differ from state to state. Now, most of the time, the state returns will mirror in some way the federal return, so they should be not too bad to work with. It depends on what state you're dealing with, on how complex the income tax return and what the format of it will be. Our focus here is on the federal return. Just realize that, the software, hopefully if you're looking at software, you want to think, is the state supported for the state software? And hopefully for the most part, if you've put the data input properly for the federal return, it'll be pretty similar to put the information in, at least in a data input format, to the state return, and the software can help you, generate the state returns for the state returns that are necessary. Now, this individual, we have one person. We're going to start off with a single individual. So we're going to say single. That's another thing that in the initial interview, you want to kind of figure that out. It should be pretty obvious for the most part. Generally, if you're talking to someone that's married, then obviously you're going to assume married filing joint unless they say a married filing separate, at which point you'd probably be saying, well, are you sure you want to do that? Because it's usually not beneficial. Single, you're going to assume the single unless you see a dependent there. So if they have a dependent, typically they'll let you know, do you have any dependents? And if that's the case, then you're questioning whether or not they have the head of household status. No dependents, single, not married, divorced, something like that. You're going to say, all right, single, pretty straightforward. We got the information. We're going to say Tim Jones. And if you have any questions about the client name or whatever, what they're called, if they're called a nickname or something like that, then of course you can get that directly from the form on the W-2. So that's something that you can pull over from the W-2. We're also going to have the address on the W-2. So the address is down here, is on the W-2. That will then be straightforward, and we can put that into the system. So we've got the name, we got the address. Now the social security number, also something you're really going to need. That's usually going to be triggering whatever software you use. If you're paying by return, you're going to want to make sure you have the first and last name, social security in there correctly, because if you're getting paid, if you're paying per return, they're probably going to charge you based on that. And if you change it, then you're gonna have a problem. They're going to charge you for it. All right, so that's going to be the employee information, the major employee, and then you're going to have the date of birth. That is not going to be, of course, on the W-2 form. That's something you're always going to want to ask about. Now I'm going to say the occupation is a computer programmer. This is something that you may be able to derive from the W-2 form, but you might as well ask them for it, because you're going to say, hey, this is going to be on the tax return. And, sometimes tax returns are used for other types of things like loans or something in the future. So you want to, put on the tax return whatever the client believes is the appropriate name for their occupation, instead of kind of guessing it from the W-2 form. That would be the best way to go. So you can get an idea from the W-2 form, but doesn't say specifically many times exactly what the occupation is. Best to ask the client directly and put exactly what their occupation is on the return. Now that's generally going to be enough information. Really all you need to kind of get going, to kind of start looking at the numbers. If you want to do a projection, you want to start looking at the numbers, you need the status, you need the name, and you'll typically need the social security number to trigger the return. And you want the birth date, just in case you're dealing with someone that has something that's going to be older generally, that will have an effect due to the birth date, such as on the standard deduction if older, like 65. Okay, so we're going to go up to the forms now and take a look at what we have so far. You'll note up top we have the filing status as single, and you could just go through here and basically check everything off, right? Filing status single, Tim Jones, check. I can verify that from the actual return. We have the social security number. We have the address. We can verify that from the W-2. We have the address that we can verify. You can have the presidential election if they so choose to do that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the presidential election, but they can elect that or not. And then we have the standard deduction information. Someone can claim you as a dependent or your spouse. So nothing there, because we're not going to, and again, if you're talking about someone that was younger, that there might be a situation there where they could be claimed on someone else's tax return as a dependent. That's when that might be applicable. And then we have the age information. Was born before January 2nd, 1955. Notice when you do enter the date of birth, the software should be able to pick that up for you automatically and make the adjustments that are necessary there. If they're blind, then there could have an effect on the standard deduction as well. That's something you would manually have to put into place. Then we have the dependents. There are no dependents at this time. That is something that you would have to ask about. Most clients would be pretty upfront with that, because they'd be pretty aware of that a dependent is something beneficial, and would let you know with that. You also might have documentation related to the dependent if they had anything such as income, or if they were going to school or having any child care or something like that, at which point there's often going to be some kind of documentation related to that provided that you'll have in the information as well. And then we're going to go back down. Now we're down to the actual numbers. So numbers on page 1, where we're going to enter the data that's from the W-2. Now on page 2, the information on page 2, we're going to go back down to the bottom where we have the sign here information. We have the computer programmer is going to be the occupation that you'll see on the return. And then if you're doing paid returns, you'll have the preparer information, which you'll have to enter into the software in order to generate the return. The IRS is going to want the P10 here in order to do all the e-file and that kind of information. If not, if it's a self-prepared return, then self-prepared return, and that's it. You just push forward. All right, so now let's enter the numbers. Let's go back to page 1 and think about the numbers we're going to be entering into this thing. We got our W-2 here, and we're going to say that we're going to be going up top. Now we've got the wages, and we've got basically the withholdings. Those are the main things we expect to be having an effect on the income tax calculation. Now, we also have the Social Security and Medicare. Again, we expect those to generally be kind of information for the IRS, but not resulting in any adjustments to taxes, because the Social Security and Medicare have already been paid, withheld, more of a flat tax, easy to calculate, easy to figure out, so that shouldn't be affecting the federal income tax that we're working with now. So therefore, we expect wages and this number, the withholdings, to have an effect. Where will those show up on our tax return when we enter this in? Line 1, we expect to change. And if we go to page 2, we would expect that the amount of withholdings should change on line 17. So those are the main two changes that we're expecting to happen. So if we go back to our detail then, and we enter this information in, I'm going to go to income, we're going to go to wages, and I'm just going to call it job 1, which is not, that's that's going to be the employer name, job 1. And then we're going to go back over here and say that we had 60,000 and 6,700 was withheld. So I'm going to say in wages is box 1, 60,000. And then what was withheld? Notice what populated for us, by the way. It populated automatically Social Security. Now, it's not necessarily the same number, but oftentimes it is, and QuickBooks is guessing that it is. And then the Medicare, same number for the wages. That's important because then the software can calculate for us what should have been withheld, and it does that for us. If any number's different than that on the W-2 form, that's an indication to us that there was an error possibly on the W-2 form, because it should, if this number is right on box, what are we on? Box 3, then this number should be calculated at 6.2% of it on box 4. So if it's not, if something else is different here, then you're going to be like, well, why would, that be that could be a problem, and that could result in some kind of change due to Social Security. But almost all the time, they got that right. All right. And then Medicare will be here, and then the Medicare calculation can be calculated for us automatically. What cannot be calculated for us is the federal income tax. So we're going to enter the federal income tax then. That was at 6,700. So 6,700. Then we can go to our forms and see what the result will be. So if we go to the forms then, and we're going to go back to page 1. Let's take it from the top. We see the change here. I had a green check mark. Now it's a red check mark because it's indicating that a change has happened. That change is what I would expect. That looks good. So that's the one change that happened. Now I'm going to have to go through the whole form to see the differences to that, to get to the difference. But the other thing that's directly from the W-2, if I go to page 2, is going to be that 6,700, which also changed. Those are the two things directly from the W-2. Based on those two numbers, we can then calculate the rest of the tax return. So let's take a look at it. We'll check them off as we go. So we've got the income. All the rest of the lines up above 7A are income-related lines. We don't have any of them, and therefore they're all blank. And on 7B, we have the 60,000. That's going to be the total income. That looks good. On 8A, we have the adjustments to income, which would be reported on Schedule 1 if there were any. We don't see any here, so we're going to say that's good. We don't have any there. We're going to go to the adjusted gross income, subtotal 60,000. Then we have the standard deductions, and we'll get into all these other line items, line by line as we go. But when we think about a simple return, what we gotta look through and go through the whole return. So we'll talk about these other deductions, standard deduction, itemized deduction, the adjustments to income, and discuss what's included in those and when they would be affected. But just going through the actual just formula right now, we have the standard deduction or the itemized. We're taking the standard deduction. Most people will, if they're going to be, if they're general taxpayers and until you get to higher income. More people will than in prior years because of the change to the tax law last year. Then we have the 60,000 minus the 12,200, giving us that 48,700. That's our taxable income. That's basically the income statement side of the tax return. So that's our taxable income, kind of like net income number. Then we'll calculate the tax on it in page 2. Page 2, tax calculated at 6,380. That's applying the progressive tax system, the progressive tax calculation. Oftentimes, we kind of rely on the software to do that because it's complicated, right? We can check, we can look at the tables and actually verify it, or we can think about the tax tables and calculate it. But most of the time, we're going to say, all right, the software is going to help us to look up the tax table. We can verify externally, as we'll do in the following presentation, with a formula what the taxable income is on page 1. And then oftentimes we'll rely to a pretty large degree for the software to take that number, taxable income, and calculate the tax on it. And we'll talk more about how that's done in future presentations. But in essence, if we go to, then we're going to see, is there a child tax credit? No, these are going to be the upper credits that don't take the tax below 0, the non-refundable credits. And so then we're back to another subtotal of the tax, $6,380. Then we have other taxes, including self-employment tax. No self-employment, that would be like a Schedule C, so that's okay, nothing there. And then line 16, add lines 14 and 15, this is your total tax. That's going to be the $3,000 or the $6,380. Then line 17 says federal income tax withheld from the W-2. This is what came out of the W-2. This was actually on the W-2. These are the payments that we made. They were taken from us by the employer, as the employer is required to do. And so we paid $6,700. Our liability, turns out, is only $6,380. Now, if all we have is a W-2, it should be the case. If we filled out our W-4 appropriately, then according to what you would think, if you fill out a W-4 form, it should fall into the place where they'll withhold a little bit more than they need to, because what they want to do is error on over withholding, providing a refund, not providing a point where you have to write a check at the end of the year. So typical case, if everything was done correctly with a simple return with just a W-2, is an over withholding, resulting in, of course, a refund in some kind. So we have a refund then here of the 320, and then the 21 says the amount of line 20 you want refunded. If Form 888 is attached, a check here, so we want the full amount refunded in this case, as opposed to being applied to the next year, which you could do. Often the times when you would do that is if you had a business and you had to make estimated payments, then you might apply the refund to an estimated payment in the following year. Then we have the payment types. How do you want to get paid? Do you want the IRS to send you a check to the address that's on the first page of the return? Or do you want to enter information, say, to your checking account, which could result in faster payment? So if you put in the e-payment, electronic payments, then that will be faster for the payment information. So then we're going to scroll down and we're going to have the sign here information. And then if it's a paid preparer form, we got the paid preparer form information. So you can review the tax return here. What you want to do is be able to enter this in the software, have a good idea of what it's looking at like here. Then next time we'll take a look at the Excel sheet and we'll enter this in more of a formula fashion. So then we'll go in here and we'll enter kind of like a tax formula. I would use this to verify when you can. If you're doing tax preparation for lower income returns, then maybe you don't have a lot of time to kind of verify with an external Excel worksheet, or you can verify by basically have one person doing the data input and possibly a second person then doing the verification, kind of like an assembly process type thing. As you get to more complex returns, I find it very useful to do another kind of quick calculation outside, because that does a few things. It verifies in my mind, how the formula works, and 2, it helps with the data input process. So obviously there's no balancing concept here. We don't have a balance sheet. We don't have the double entry kind of accounting concept to help us to feel that we have some kind of check against just a data input error. And therefore, if you just input it twice, one time into the tax return and another time into basically an Excel worksheet in slightly different formats, you get that double verification that could catch any simple just data input errors.